Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Maura Policelli, and I'm the Executive Director of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs, Washington office. I have the honor of moderating tonight's discussion. This series, Bridging the Divide, is being organized by Notre Dame's Provost Office in partnership with the Klaus Center for Civil and Human Rights, which is one of the institutes at the Keough School of Global Affairs, and the Rooney Center for the Study of American Democracy. So this session kicks off the Bridging the Divide series. And the purpose of the series is to promote civil discussion and thoughtful policy conversations in the run-up to the November 3rd election. Regardless of political party, ideology, or stance on specific policies, we are Americans. We believe in representative democracy, care deeply about our nation and its future. Regardless of the outcome of this year's election, we are part of the Notre Dame family and aim to represent the university with the dignity she deserves. Our shared goal as a university community is to promote civil discourse and respect one another, especially when we disagree. This first session, Beyond Good Manners, Promoting Civil Discussion on Issues That Divide Us, sets the stage for the Bridging the Divide series by focusing on the notion of ethical argument and a key component of policy arguments, information. In the short time we have together, we will explore the prevalence of misinformation and how our brains process it, learn how to defend ourselves against misinformation, and understand the principles of ethical argument, which can guide us in our personal and professional interactions. Joining us for this conversation are John Duffy, the O'Malley Director of Notre Dame's Writing Program, who studies and writes about the ethics of rhetoric, Professor Tim Winiger, the Frank Freeman Collegiate Professor of Engineering, who studies how people consume and curate information, and Professor Lisa Fazio, an Assistant Professor of Psychology at Vanderbilt University, who studies how people learn new information, both true and false, and how to correct errors in people's knowledge. So let me get started. We will have time to take questions from the audience, but we're going to spend some time engaging with our excellent panel. So obviously we had our first presidential debate last night. And based on the expertise that each of you bring to this conversation tonight, I'd like to get some of your feedback on what most of us in the country and possibly around the world experienced last night. So let's start with you, John. You teach a course here at Notre Dame called Ethical Argument. So what example from last night's debate would fit well into your curriculum?
It's a great question. First of all, let me say thanks, hello to everyone, and thank you for choosing to spend your time with us tonight. I would say that nothing and everything would fit into the course. Nothing in the sense that what we saw last night, strictly speaking, was an argument. Argument is a set of reasons, excuse me, given to critique or to defend a proposition that's uncertain. We didn't see that last night, not really. What we saw last night was a lot of interruptions, a lot of insults, personal attacks, contradictions, and so those aren't really arguments. Ethical argument is argument that's grounded in certain principles. And if I may, just without getting too technical about it, when we argue, the common understanding of argument is, win, lose, dominate, and so forth. But there are many other reasons to argue. We argue to inquire, we argue to persuade, we argue to discover. And one of the things that we ask in the course I teach is what is like successful and what is likely to inhibit. And for arguments to be successful, we have to assume there's a relationship between speakers, and that relationship will be most productive if it's grounded in things like trust, truthfulness, accountability, integrity, intellectual generosity, open-mindedness, and so forth. None of those were on display last night, really. So if I were to use any of that debate in the course, I would, and I do this sometimes, here are some examples of things we shouldn't do. So I would say that what we saw last night really wasn't argument at all.
And we'll definitely circle back to some of that in just a moment. Tim, you're a computer scientist with expertise in analyzing misinformation in social media. So in what ways do you anticipate, and maybe it's already occurred, that the debate might be contributing or have contributed to such efforts at misinformation here in the US?
So Maura, that's a great question. And like John, I'd like to thank you for having me here, and I look forward to the discussion tonight. In what ways did the debate last night contribute to misinformation? It's a great question. Of course, there's in any kind of presidential debate, there's going to be a lot of back and forth and maybe misconstruing arguments. And misinformation, in my definition, is not just someone says something wrong, but it's misinformation is typically, in my definition, when I get interested, is when there's a coordinated, inauthentic behavior, where people or a group or maybe a foreign government or foreign group collectively gets together and tries to, through different technical means, persuade people on social media and other ways to believe something that's not true. The one thing, I guess, now that you mention it, that I've been thinking about that we have seen evidence of is this idea of fraudulent elections. And so there's coordinated campaigns from all over the world trying to get Americans to believe that this election is going to be fraudulent, when the evidence shows that that's typically not, well, it's just not true. So one thing that we've seen a lot is misconstruing facts. And so a lot of things we see in social media are taking nuggets of truth, little bits of information that are true, and then wildly exaggerating them. So one example that you see is this idea that that ballots are being thrown away. And there, it is true that there was old ballots from years ago that were put into a garbage can because they're old ballots. But what people are seeing then is that there's the misinformation there, is that people are saying that ballots are being thrown away when that's just not true. So they're taking nuggets of truth that are harmless and without a problem, and they're spinning these stories and circulating them in coordinated, inauthentic fashions to persuade individuals something that, like I said, is just not true. So that's one example that I see from last night, and I'm sure if I thought about it more, I could think of a dozen different examples. But
okay. And Lisa, you're a psychologist, and you study what happens to our brains and our behavior in the context of misinformation and the atmosphere that we're in, not just online. So what concerns you regarding the experience that viewers had last night? And what do you recommend for voters going forward, whether it's the additional debates or other experiences between now and election day? Some voting's already begun, so voters are really, in some cases, trying to make up their mind.
Yeah, I think one of the things we saw last night was a lot of misinformation and false information being spread. And what my research has shown is that it's hard to detect that information when you're not warned ahead of time, when you don't know what to be looking out for. So in general, when we interact with people, we expect them to tell us the truth. We have this assumption that that's what's going to happen. And so that's how our brains interpret information. There's kind of this natural assumption that what I'm hearing is probably reliable and I should act on it. And so when you have a situation like the debate, when there's a lot of misinformation and false information interspersed in there, it can be difficult to determine what's true or false, even if you should know ahead of time. Even if you've got the knowledge in your head somewhere, it might not be active as you're listening. And so one of the best things people can do to prepare for these types of situations, or just to inoculate themselves against misinformation, is to understand what are the themes that misinformation tends to be around. So you know that there's going to be some false statements about voter fraud. You should probably be alert when you hear one of those. So like the one that Tim mentioned, if you hear about something about ballots being destroyed, that's a headline that you shouldn't just accept on first glance. You should read the full story. You should Google, see what other people are saying about it, because though you'll be alerted that those are the types of things that misinformation is commonly spread around.
Yeah, and speaking of headlines, Tim, in terms of what you see on social media with articles being shared and that behavior of, articles and headlines pushed around, on different platforms, is that something that you see trends around that that fit into what Lisa's saying about?
Yeah. So
investigation.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for the question about headlines. It turns out that, and we're all of us, including myself, are guilty of being headline browsers, especially on social media. So if I have my phone out and I'm scrolling through my Facebook or Twitter feed, most of what I do is I scroll. I'm looking at headlines. I'm maybe looking at pictures, but most of the time what I do is I scroll. Every so often I'll stop and I'll like something, and even less often I will actually share something. But when I share something or when I like something, what that's doing is it's telling the algorithm, telling the Twitter, the Facebook system that I believe this I'm endorsing this headline, this statement. And that's a powerful editorial signal that you're giving to the system. We are the editors of our friends' news feeds. Like it or not, that's the truth. And it turns out, though, we're not very good editors. 75% on Twitter, 75% on Reddit, and I think Facebook self-reports 96% of all headlines are shared without the user clicking on the link. That is, they're scrolling through, they read a headline, I assume they read the headline, and they share it without ever reading it. And then we wonder, why does misinformation spread? Well, it's because we are not conscious of the likes and shares that we make and how important they are to the algorithm, and how much our friends are relying upon us to make good decisions for the news that they see. So that's a responsibility that we have. But it is kind of a disturbing trend that we see, is that people scroll and share without giving it much thought. And if I could wish one thing of all of us, is to give more thought into the things that we like and share on social media, because your votes matter. Your electoral votes matter, and your social media votes matter as well.
Yeah, and so John, whether it's engaging online with friends sending articles or just more headlines, or in person, in this atmosphere, what is your advice to your students and others about counter arguments, responding in this atmosphere when in some cases it may be a surface level acknowledgement of arguments, or information or knowledge neglect, as Lisa calls it. So on the counter argument part of this equation, what is your advice?
Yeah, well, it's interesting what Professor Fazio and Professor Weniger just brought up. We've had to build into our course lessons on how do you read arguments, online arguments, how do you share them, how do you check the sources, because there is so much misinformation. So we do spend time talking about how to verify a source and where it comes from, following the trail of information, and that may mean taking several steps, not so much to verify the argument itself, but even prior to that, to verify the source of it, its origin. And frequently, you can, if students are, if they get into the habit of some of these changes, it's really, it's meticulous sort of work. But to your other question about counter arguments, that's our jargon, a counter argument for looking at the other side of an argument, for considering another perspective. And that's different from sort of passing along, obviously, social media, Facebook headline. But it's absolutely central to writing or creating or even just engaging in ethical argumentation. Essentially what we're asking students to do when we ask them to look at alternative perspectives is to consider those views seriously. And it's very, very hard, as I'm sure you know. If you come into, like last night when I sat down to watch the debate, I had some very strong views about, you know, my beliefs in various issues. Now, if I'm reading about those issues and I encounter perspectives that disagree with mine, or that question mine, or that threaten or, you know, potentially undermine things that I believe, my initial reaction is to kind of dismiss that. You know, it's to sort of push against that. That can't be true based on what I know. But that's not always the healthiest way for us to create arguments. In fact, if we're unwilling to do that, then we're not really arguing, we're just kind of existing in echo chambers. So one of the things we talk about, and I mentioned things like, you know, truthfulness and accountability and intellectual generosity. These are all examples of qualities, or what moral philosophers call virtues. And so one of the virtues we ask students to practice when they are in our courses is to practice the virtue of intellectual courage. And that means going up and taking seriously those arguments that threaten to undermine our own. And as I say, that's really hard to do. And one of the things you have to do is develop good judgment about which one of these arguments should you take seriously. Some of them you shouldn't. You know, if there was a debate that went on about a year or two ago when a well-known white supremacist was invited onto campus. And one of the things, not our campus, but other campuses, public campuses, and there was a legal question about did colleges have to invite this person or provide a space for him? But there was also what we called what we thought of as an ethical question. How do you respond to someone like that? Where is the line that you draw, and how do you get there? So these are all things that need a lot of practice and a lot of thought, and counter arguments, I think, is the absolute essence of an ethical argument. You know, to go to that view that threatens your, may cause you to take the most radical step of all, which is to change your mind and take it seriously. It's very hard to do, but it's critical.
John, I have a question, if I may. This is about people arguing online. So in my experience on Facebook and Twitter, that you're going to have these back and forth arguments, and they almost never result in someone changing their mind. I've never seen that happen, right? No one has ever said, "Oh, that was a good point, I changed my mind now." That's not a thing you see on social media.
Right.
So should people still then engage in these online discussions, or what's the point if there's no minds being changed? And in general, what is your general thoughts on the current state of online discourse that you see?
Well, I share your view that it rarely results in enlightenment. It rarely results in people saying, you know, that's an excellent point. Let me go back and rethink my own view. I think it must be 5 or 6 years ago now that Scientific American disabled the comments versions on their articles because they said that the discussions were so mendacious and that they were so off base that they were actually harming science. That people were arguing things that simply weren't true. So if you go to Scientific American online now, there's no place for you to have these online arguments. So I think students need to be, and all of us, myself included, need to be really, really careful about investing that kind of time in those arguments.
Well, I'm going to ask Lisa to jump in here. Some of your research, comes into play here about, people's ability to actually correct their own ideas once they've formed, even if they've been formed based on misinformation. So maybe you can jump in here.
Yeah, so one thing I wanted to say was actually a little bit of a hopeful note. So there's some research from Letitia Bode and her colleagues at Georgetown showing that comments that are made on Facebook posts, so someone posts something incorrect, a false article, an incorrect health claim, things like that, when people respond to that with the correct information, that may or may not change the mind of the person who posted it, kind of depending on if it was just that they posted it because they were in a hurry and didn't really pay attention to it, or if they posted it because they really think it's correct. But what that correction can do is help bystanders. So the other people who then see that post in the social media feed see the post, but then they also see the comment correcting it. And so they're much less likely to be fooled by the misinformation because that correction's already there. Mm-hmm. And they've done some experiments looking at kind of who that correction comes from, and it doesn't seem to matter all that much. So it's effective if it comes from a friend, it's effective if it comes from a government organization, if it comes from a nonprofit. There's some small variations, but in general, that type of thing seems to be helpful for the other people who are going to see the post.
And that can that counter the repetition on belief notion that you've researched?
Yeah, it can help. So one of the problems of the finding that Tim was talking about, where people only read the headlines, is that we know from my research and others that just repetition increases belief. So if you hear the same thing multiple times, you're more likely to think that it's true. And these kind of pithy headlines are just kind of made for increasing that belief. And one thing that we found that can help to reduce that is to get people to stop relying on kind of simple peripheral cues like repetition and familiarity, and instead rely on their actual knowledge and beliefs. So if you can get people to slow down and actually think about what they're reading, we do this sometimes by asking people to just answer, how do you know that this is true or false? And by getting them to slow down and think about that, we reduce their intentions to share false information and also reduce the kind of boost in truth that you get from repetition.
And so, Lisa, I guess I have another question. I don't mean to take your questions, Maura, but
go for it.
Twitter recently has been beta testing a new system that will be if you share something or retweet it, I guess, without reading it, it'll prompt you. It'll say, have you read this post yet? Maybe you should read it before you share it. It'll actually slow you down on purpose. And so is that a hopeful sign for you? Or do you think that's aimed at the wrong thing?
No, I love that intervention. And I've seen them beta testing it, and I hope that they kind of roll it out further. I think that type of friction could be really valuable in this space. I also think another thing that can help is just reminding people of kind of having an accuracy mindset, and that we should have a goal as a society to tell the truth. And I think most people do have an internal goal that they want to be accurate and they want to tell the truth. And so reminding them that, as you said, you're the editor of other people's social media feeds. And so before you blast this to kind of all of your friends, you should check to see if it's true first.
So Tim, a lot of your research on behalf of the U.S. government, the intelligence community and Defense Department in this regard, has given you insights on how other countries are doing with disinformation and empowering consumers. Do you have any examples that we should be drawing from here in the U.S.?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's a couple of cases. So for the audience at home, I frequently work with the intelligence and defense communities of the U.S. government. So never on American domestic problems, but one thing we're watching is Indonesia specifically. It's a fascinating case. It's a young democracy. They're just kind of over the last decade or so been voting, and they're a growing, burgeoning democracy. But they have now, at the same time, it's also an interesting country because Facebook and Twitter are just now kind of making inroads throughout all four corners of Indonesia as well. And one thing we're seeing is that there's a lot of Chinese influence in Indonesia. And China has a really interesting kind of way of spreading what we call coordinated inauthentic behavior. So if something that's maybe not flattering to the Chinese government comes out, what China likes to do is flood social media. And so they'll create thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of images, and absolutely flood social media with these, whatever counter messaging they're trying to get out. And so that's something we see in China. Internally in Indonesia, we see some interesting things with images. And so it turns out that there's a young YouTube celebrity, and she was frequently photoshopped with different hand signs in her in images, and that gets shared around. And it turns out that that photoshopping of these either the one or the two, this is how Indonesians say two, represent their preference on the ballot. And so what you see a lot in Indonesia is these photoshopping of fingers and hand gestures on famous celebrity images, and those get shared around as well. Kind of a fascinating case study in misinformation. But one thing we learned is you can really understand and learn a lot about a country and a region and a culture by looking at how they manipulate images. And just watching that from an outsider perspective is really kind of fascinating.
And are Indonesians on top of this? Are they, savvy to understand the photoshopping any more than any other country? Who's the least vulnerable?
Yeah, so this is actually a really interesting problem. And this is actually exactly our goal in this particular case. And since Facebook and Twitter and the internet in general is brand new in Indonesia, for example, and because Indonesia is a new democracy where information is power, they're actually not very savvy. And we've actually surveyed tens of thousands of Indonesians. We've called them on the phone and asked them questions, and they're having a really hard time with this. And actually part of what Notre Dame is doing, Notre Dame is leading an initiative, not just in Indonesia, but around the world, for advancing integrity in media, to try to educate people, to do taking Lisa's research, for example, in trying to inoculate people, for lack of a better term. Now it's coronavirus time, so inoculate might not be a bad analogy, against disinformation, to let them know that, hey, this is how China or other misinformation campaigns are running. You should be aware of it and guard yourself against it. Yeah. So that's what we're doing at Notre Dame.
That's great. And just while we're on the examples of misinformation, Lisa, can you explain deep fakes to those of us who are not always familiar with these different terms?
Yeah, so deep fakes are something that pop up in the news fairly regularly. It's when you take kind of advanced machine learning algorithms to kind of edit videos to make it seem like someone's saying something that they didn't. So there's a famous one of Obama talking about how great Killmonger from Black Panther is. That was a funny one that was produced in order to show the damages that these can do. And so there's a lot of news media coverage of these. There's a lot of work trying to detect them and notice when they're happening. The problem is that's not really where the issues are right now. Like Tim was mentioning, most of the misinformation you see right now is simple Photoshop. It's things that we know how to detect already. It's using pictures out of context. One thing you'll often see is people taking pictures that happened after a concert, like the mess that people left, and then claiming that that's the mess that was left after a protest or something like that. And so there's lots of ways that images currently get used to fool people and to fuel these debates that are much simpler than deepfakes and much more concerning, I think.
Yeah. And John, I know that, for a while you've been involved even outside the classroom at Notre Dame and working with students on political discourse and engaging with each other when there's different political parties or issues that they represent. I know there's limitations on some of that now with the restrictions due to COVID, but in your experience and to the extent it's possible now, how do you see our students managing this environment, talking about their social media experiences, but when face-to-face, is it a different process? Do you see some tools developing?
Well, I think students are becoming increasingly aware of the kinds of things that Lisa and Tim are talking about. I think they've become much more sophisticated over the last 3 or 4 years, 5 years maybe, in terms of adopting a somewhat critical mindset when it comes to their own use of social media and the information that they receive on social media. So while I think it's a huge challenge and continues to be, I'm hopeful based on the things, and this is anecdotal on my part. I've not done the kinds of research my colleagues have done, but I'm hopeful based on the kinds of things that students tell me and the sorts of things they're writing in classes about how social media can be used and abused.
Yeah, and I know that we'll have one of the, I was going to say, just to give a plug in, one of the sessions, I forget which week it is, but one of the sessions as part of this series features Bridge ND, which I know, John, you support that student group, a very impressive group of students. So they'll get a chance to speak for themselves and show off their civil discourse skills. But go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to say about Bridge ND, they really are a radical group in terms of our current discourse and our current state of politics. And by radical, I mean different, very extremely different. They are dedicated to making an effort to reaching out to people on all sides of the political spectrum and really listening to them and creating opportunities. And I don't want to speak for them, they'll do better speaking for themselves, but I do want to mention them as a kind of model for students who are seeking an alternative to our present tribalized public discourse.
Yeah. Tim?
And I did want to chime in to talk about the difference, I think, in something we're finding in Indonesia that we've been studying, as well as other countries, is that the kids, the children, the college students and the high school students, what we might call the digital natives, they're going to be fine. It's the folks my age and older that are kind of the ones who didn't grow up in the messy social media internet that are having a harder time with this. And in Indonesia, it's not that you're some, age and older. It's just that, did you grow up in your formative years on social media? You understand how the technology works. And so having that kind of digital kind of adeptness about you is important. And what we find is that the worst spreaders of disinformation and misinformation are typically those who are my age and older, actually. And so the college students, we have people like John and others from around the world in the high schools and colleges teaching media literacy tools. But what we need to do, I think, is actually reach out to those who are no longer in school and inform them and give them the tools and technologies to help with it. And I also want to just briefly interject to say to John's last point is that this isn't actually a new problem. We've had disinformation for as long as we've had newspapers. If you think of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, remember that movie from like the 1930s with
telegrams?
Right. That movie was about disinformation. That was the plot of that movie.
Yeah.
And so it's been around for ages, and we just have a new technology now spreading it around. So I'm hopeful also that we will figure this out. It might take some time, there'll be some growing pains, but we'll be okay. It'll just take effort.
Let's be hopeful. I do want to just bring in Lisa on this point because I imagine the pendulum, obviously, when it swings to extremes, can be a concern. In this respect, is there a nervousness of too much cynicism that, let's just not trust any news, any sources, because we understand about deep fakes and Photoshop, so let's just throw the baby out with the bathwater and not be engaged or trying to find the good sources in the news? What are you finding?
Yeah, I think this is one of the problems with how we sometimes run media literacy, is that we tell people all of the things that they should look out for and all the reasons they should distrust information. Right. And a lot of people, especially college students, often just kind of throw their hands up. All right, I'm done. I just won't trust anything. Right. And we can't actually have a democracy like that. You need to trust some sources. You can't be out there calculating unemployment numbers on your own. There has to be trust in sources. And so I think what's really important are some of the skills that John teaches in his classes on argumentation and understanding why you should believe some things, why you shouldn't believe others, what's the evidence behind them. And I think it's important to get people to trust reputable news organizations and to understand all the steps that they go through to try and get things right, while also showing the flaws in some other less reputable sources.
Yeah, I really want to underscore what Lisa just said. I think to get our hands around this problem, that people have to be able to do two things. One is that they have to be able to critique the deceptions and the misinformation. That's obviously critical. You have to be able to understand how that works and have tools to resist it. But that's not enough. You also have to be able to construct arguments that are grounded in some of the things we've been talking about, in truthfulness, in trust, in open-mindedness. It can't simply be about critique. We have to also have a language for building the kinds of arguments and therefore the kinds of community and the kinds of democracy that we want to have. And that really does take us into, thinking about, well, what does it mean to be a truthful speaker and writer? What does it mean to be intellectually generous or intellectually open-minded, to exercise judgment when we make arguments? Those things are really critical. I think college, we are good in the humanities, and I'll be a little critical of my own my own sort of provenance. We're really good at teaching students teaching the skills of deconstructing and skepticism and critique. We're good at that, and that's part of what we exist for. But I think we are in a cultural moment where we want to be looking at things we can sort of build as well. We don't simply want to analyze the ruins. We want to be able to sort of rebuild how and give students some faith that they can go forward and that they can participate in a project that will take them past our current sort of nihilistic moment.
Well, I'm going to be conscious of time. I'm going to jump into some of the great questions that we have had submitted, and building off of what you were just talking about, John. Katie in Chicago and Deirdre in Tucson sent us similar questions that basically get at how do you respond when people refuse to acknowledge your point or just say your point is not true. So kind of getting through what is the most effective way to break through this wall of divisiveness is Katie's question. And then Deirdre asks, what is necessary for us as a nation to create a broadly accepted minimum level of civility? What can each of us do to make this happen? Thank you for bringing it down to the personal responsibility, Deirdre. So any of our panelists want to help us out there?
I'm going to try on the first one. Is engaging people. So if you're arguing with someone, especially on social media or in a public square, it's not necessarily about trying to convince that person. Now there's ways that you can argue with someone and try to be more convincing. You can think of the Socratic method, and I'm sure John can talk about lots of different ways of trying to be persuasive. But it's also important to remember that the argument's not about trying to convince the other person. The argument that you're trying to make should try to convince the other people who are passing by, the other readers of the argument. So if someone says something that you don't think is true, you're probably not going to be able to convince them, and they might just disagree with you because they want to disagree with you, and you have to live with that. Your job, though, is not to convince them, but to convince the other people who are scrolling.
Yeah.
So John, do you have any other?
Yeah, I think that's a really smart response. I would say that, in situations where two individuals or small groups are arguing and we cannot find some common ground, I think we just have to accept that that's a reality. We cannot always expect that we're going to find consensus. We can learn a lot from when we don't find consensus. We can learn a lot from what I call dissensus, right? But what I would tell my students, argue ways that there's tomorrow. We want to argue in ways that if you and I cannot come to some agreement about immigration or about the environment, that we haven't argued in ways that we've destroyed one another or scarred one another. We've burned down the bridges and all the buildings in our efforts to be victorious in this particular argument. So how do you do that? It's not really all that complicated. You listen. You know, this is the first step, and it should be the first step in any argument, is listening to the other side, asking people why they believe the things they believe, asking them why they don't believe the things that you're presenting to them. Give them an opportunity to talk to you and take them seriously. I think, you know, a lot of our arguments are so hair triggered because we feel the other side doesn't respect us or in some ways is trying to humiliate us. And that's often true, especially online. But that's not the way that we're going to go forward. So I would say, you know, we have to be able to listen to people and respect them and show them respect and try to argue in ways that if we're not going to win, to accept it, or we're not going to persuade, to accept that that's reality. The other thing I would say, and then I'll turn it back over to others, is, you know, I tell students, we don't have to genuflect before Aristotle, right? Aristotle is not the be all and the end all, but he said a lot of smart things. He also said a lot of reprehensible things, but he said some smart things too. And one of the smart things he said was, don't argue with everyone, okay? Because they'll just drag you down. And you have to be able to know when the argument is worth making and when it's really not worth making. So that's another skill to work on. You know, there are certain people, I think we have to make a judgment. This is not a productive use of my emotional energy, my intellectual energy. And thanks for your thoughts. I'm going to move on, you know. Now, when you do that, how you do that, that calls for judgments.
And one thing I think that's also important is to recognize that you actually might be wrong.
Yes, absolutely.
It's rare, but you might actually be wrong.
Almost never happens, but yeah. No, and that's the tough one, right? I mean, that's the tough one when you start to hear arguments that you think, you know, if you're really getting disturbed as you listen to somebody else or you read something and it's disturbing you, that may be an indication that you may not have all the facts, or that your perspective may be narrow or more limited, or in fact wrong.
Yeah, and then getting back to the debate where, you know, it's very unique to, you know, a televised debate viewed by millions is a different setting than, you know, scrolling through your Facebook page or other social media headlines. But to the extent viewers who have strong beliefs in policies or ideologies represented by either of the candidates, witnessing, being a passerby, to a bystander to that interaction, what does that do to those beliefs when the messenger of those is not representing you or your beliefs in a way that you're comfortable? Is that something that that you've looked at, Lisa, at all from the psychologist perspective?
I haven't personally, but we know that kind of the source of an argument is really important. So people are more likely to accept kind of a debunking if it's from someone who shares their core beliefs. On information about climate change, Republicans trust other Republicans more than they'll trust a Democrat on that issue. And so will change their beliefs more after hearing from someone who kind of counts as one of their own. And I think this also links into the idea that all of us are wrong sometimes. I think one of the things my research has really shown is that all of us sometimes have this knowledge neglect, where we're fooled by what we read because we don't notice the contradiction between what we already know. And we often think of misinformation as something that only happens to other people, only happens to people who are dumber than us, or only happens to people who are on the other side of the political aisle. And the truth is that we all get fooled sometimes. And it's something that we all need to keep an eye out for and kind of prevent from spreading farther.
Yeah.
And I want to add on briefly to that. One of the things that we've noticed in our studies of of other countries is, well, we've been watching people and we've asked people actually just point out, it's like, this is wrong. Did you know it was wrong? And they'll say, well, yeah. And then we would scratch our heads and say, well, why did you share this thing that you know to be false? It actually happens more than I initially expected, that people will knowingly share things that are false. They're false and they know it's false and they share it anyway. And this happens a lot as a signaling to their in group, to say that I am a Democrat, even though this is false, I'm going to share it because I'm going to signal that I am one of the group. Or if I'm a Republican, then I'm going to share this conservative thing that I know to be false as a signal to be part of the group. And so this idea of group identity, and of course I'm no psychologist, is it appears to me to be stronger than our yearning for fact and truth. And that's something that we're going to have to grapple with, I think, moving forward.
And I think that's also something that platforms could help with. So these kind of norms of accuracy. So there are subreddits on Reddit that have very strong norms of accuracy and kind of strong moderation. And there's an expectation that if you post something, it will be true and it will be vetted. And you will have this kind of civil debate among things for things that can't objectively be determined. And so you can set up social media sites to encourage that type of accuracy. And I think that even simple prompts like, remember that there's an election going on and we all want to support the spread of true information, be careful what you share. Simple like reminders like that we should have this accuracy motivation, I think would be really powerful.
Yeah, and I definitely don't want to miss asking before we run out of time. Any specific recommendations? You just mentioned, Lisa, subreddits, and are there any specific sites or tools for kind of taking a headline or a source of information and kind of having it fact checked somewhere out there on the internet? What are some practical tips for, I guess, especially those of us who are older than Tim, who obviously are not as good at this as our Notre Dame students?
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind is it's no longer good enough to just look and see if a site seems professional. So there are websites right now that will very realistically mimic kind of local news sites, even though they're fake. And there are some sites that look like they were designed in the 90s and don't look that reputable, but actually are from government organizations and things like that. So you can't go by how it looks. Instead, what I think is the most powerful thing is just to throw the headline or some search tools into Google or your favorite search engine and see what pops up. If it's true, there should be multiple places reporting that same news. And if it's false, you'll likely get a fact check article talking about why that's wrong. But in general, if you see something that only one news outlet is reporting, or kind of only one site, especially a site that you've never heard of, is reporting, that should be a signal to you to kind of be wary of what you're reading.
Yeah. And what Lisa's mentioning reminds me of this. Is called pink slime journalism. There are thousands and thousands, maybe tens of thousands of websites that are set up to mimic local news. And there's one over in Elkhart. There's one up in Niles, Michigan, that says this is the NilesEveningNews.com. That's not actually the title, but I don't want to give it away. That look like reputable television and newspaper stations. So beware of that. Just because it says this is the Elkhart News, it very well could be a foreign influence operation that's lying in wait to spring to some end.
So double checking the source itself, seeing if it exists, can be helpful. John, any final advice? Let's see, a question we have here. It must be disappointing for someone in your position to see the status of our country. If you had a magic wand, how would you create a way out of this? I was thinking that earlier about trust. Can trust be rebuilt in sources, in institutions? That's another question earlier in here about that someone wrote, John from Worthington. It was about with all the accusations of fake news and alternative facts, and where do we go from here, John?
Well, wow.
Regardless of how the election turns out, this is where we are.
I want to sound an optimistic note here, if I may. This is a kind of thought experiment I do when I give talks on this. At Notre Dame, we have a writing program that offers about 35 sections a semester, 70 sections a year. There are 16 students in each class, okay? So that's about 1,100 students every year who go through our classes. In our classes, we really do emphasize, yes, we're going to learn to critique fake news, and we're going to work on media literacy, but we're also going to work on creating arguments that are grounded in these things we've been talking about, in trust, in accountability, in truthfulness, in open-mindedness, and so forth. And so every 4 years, or every year rather, we graduate at Notre Dame approximately 1,100 students who have been through that class and who have been exposed, at least exposed to the idea that arguments say about their character and the kinds of communities they want to live in, as the arguments say about whatever their topic might be. So that's, as I say, 1,100 roughly every year. 3 years, you got 3,300. 5 years, you got about 5,000 people. That's Notre Dame. In South Bend, there are 3 or 4 other colleges. Go south a few hundred miles and you have IU and Purdue, and they have much, much larger writing programs. They turn out thousands of students. We have 21 million students right now, roughly, enrolled in higher education. 5 million of those students are in the first year, approximately, probably more because students drop out. And some very large percentage, and let's just be very conservative and say 1 million of them or 2 million are going through classes very much like the ones at Notre Dame, because this is what writing classes do. That means every year, 1 million, 2 or 3 years, 3 million, 5 years, 5 million people are running around loose in our society who have been exposed to the idea that there is a way to argue that is grounded in the qualities that we've been talking about. I'm optimistic when I think in that way. When I think of my generation, and I'm probably the oldest person on the screen tonight, I don't have much faith or hope that there's going to be, sort of widespread transformation. Somebody once said to me, do you really think this kind of thinking is going to help someone like Rush Limbaugh? And I said, of course not. He's too rich and it's too late for him. We can't help him, but we can help all of the young people that are in our courses today. And I've just mentioned writing courses. I haven't even addressed computer science courses, psychology, philosophy, sociology courses. This is what higher education should be doing. It should be giving students a sense of a positive way to interact with one another, in a disciplinary context, but in other ways as well. So I'm optimistic in these terms, so much that we're going to be able to solve all the immediate problems, but that if we continue to seed our public discourse with people who come out of our institutions thinking that they have some stake in this, and that the arguments they make are going to say much about them and the communities they want to build, I feel more optimistic.
It's heartwarming to know that we've got all those young people out there who are critical thinkers. I want to just circle back to Deirdre's question about individually what we can do. And I'm wondering if we should, and I'm asking myself, should I take on the challenge to get on Facebook tonight, which I'm not on much, engage, I guess, find something I disagree with and purposefully demonstrate thoughtful civil engagement in responding to it, as you've all advised, not because I'll necessarily change the mind of whoever posted it or sent it, but because there are bystanders on the internet, in social media. So to, John, picking our efforts, because it can be draining, but just engaging, even just one thoughtful civil query at a time Is that something we should all take away to try to do, to model that in person or on social media?
I think John made the really good point that these are skills and they take practice. And so the only way you're going to get better at them is to try and use them, to listen carefully to your opponents, think deeply about what they're saying and what your counter arguments are, and to move forward from there. But it's definitely a discussion that you can have in person or on the phone or on Zoom and in other situations with people. And I definitely encourage that.
Yeah, and your other tip, Lisa, which is good in many respects, to slow down. I think you even, one of your articles, said to, take a breath when you're reading something and see how it's making you feel, I think is how you'd put it, to process a little bit the information we're reading, to get a sense of a little bit of a gut reaction before we do something with it is,
Yeah. I mean, a lot of false things are really emotional and kind of they're out there to try and get this emotional reaction from you so that you'll share them, so that they can either make money or so that they can spread disinformation, spread dissent across the country, various goals. And so one simple rule I like to use is that if something makes you feel really good or really bad, that's probably a signal that you should stop and check what you're reading. If you read a headline and you're like, oh my gosh, that's so good, I can't wait to share that with all my friends, that's probably a time to check in and see if that's real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's a really hard habit to break. It's think before you share, slow down, recognize your reaction, and remember that your name is attached to that, right? On Facebook, if I share something false, it says this is shared by Tim Winiger, and my credibility is on the line, right? And people don't like to be lied to, and I don't want to lie to people. And so what Lisa's saying, slow down, be thoughtful, because your social votes and shares, they actually matter. They really do.
I really like the idea, the metaphor that you had earlier, when both of you were talking about being the editor of your social media account. I hadn't seen that or thought about that before, and I really like that. That's a great way to communicate it.
The power of the click that we all have, and knowing now, Tim, that obviously we should all know everything we do is tracked, but this notion of, have I forwarded an article that I haven't opened? I have to reflect and wonder if I have, because that does seem, to be irresponsible. If I haven't thoroughly read something and been captivated by a headline, then I shouldn't share it. So that's a good tip for us all.
I am guilty. So when I was doing this study, we enrolled several hundred people, and they were kind of watching what they were sharing, with their permission, of course. And I had actually enrolled myself, and I was basically doing the analytics on my own social media, and I was equally guilty. Mm-hmm. And I'm supposed to be, doing it right. Yeah. And so it's important, though, that we all have human tendencies and biases, and we all want to root for our political team, and we all want to win arguments, but it's important that we all take time, and it's difficult. It's a habit that we have to break.
Yep.
But to slow down.
The final serious note that I am very intentionally making sure we end on is the specific issue of trusting the election and trusting voting. That is obviously now, in the atmosphere. And if each of you could just, leave our audience with your specific thought on, here in the US, the information that we're all being exposed to about trusting the system, whether it's mailing or voting in person. What are your thoughts on that atmosphere that we're all in as we lead up to November 3rd?
I think it's important to remember that we're a democracy. One of the major tenets of democracy is we have elections, we count every vote, and there's evidence that that's what we do. There's no evidence of any widespread voter fraud in the US in recent history. Many states have very successfully been voting entirely by mail for many years, if not decades. These are conspiracies that don't really have, that aren't really rooted in fact. And so I think if we lose confidence in our elections, then we've lost our democracy. And so it's important to not lose confidence based on misinformation rather than real information.
And if I can make a prediction, and this is actually going back to the inoculation that we've been trying to talk about, is that I predict on November the 4th, there will be a slew of news headlines and Twitter bots and Facebook accounts that come live and share and really promote this idea that the vote was unfair. Expect to see that. It will be unauthentic. It will not be real. And it'll be coordinated by shady characters that I don't know exactly who yet. We know this is going to happen. We're working on ways to countermand it, but expect that to happen, but don't lose faith. I am confident that the vote count, as each state does it, will be accurate. But in the meantime, there will be a coordinated information kind of attack right around and after the election. So, but again, I'm supremely confident that we'll get through it and we'll be okay.
Yeah, I would say that we started this conversation by referencing the debate last night, and one of the features of the debate and in our discourse more generally is conspiracy theories that, as Tim and Lisa have pointed out, social media has been able to weaponize these and spread them in ways that are unprecedented in the history of our country, and indeed probably in the history of the world. So when we talk about civil discourse, I always feel it's important to just point this out as well. Civil discourse does not mean agreement to everything. And civil discourse does not mean that we surrender our critical faculties. You know, the right response to injustice is not sort of tempered forbearance, as someone once wrote. You know, it's indignation. And I think, you know, we are going to have to find the balance between you know, refusing to accept conspiracy theories and to continue to fight for the democracy that I think most of us want and believe in, and while at the same time, you know, being able to argue in ways that are consistent with our own ethical principles, or the ethical principles that we are trying to develop in everyday life.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all so much, all three of you, for being with us tonight. And the Bridging the Divide series continues next week on Tuesday, October 6th. That'll be the next discussion in the series. And that one will explore political polarization in America, a perfectly appropriate segue from this conversation, discussing key milestones and influences that have led to the current polarization in American politics. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you to our three fantastic experts this evening. Everybody be safe, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.